The Atlantic Revolutions and the Enlightenment of the Revolutionary Age is our lecture for today. So between 1775 and 1825, the Atlantic world changed. And it was influenced by an evolving concept of supreme power over people versus human rights and that of society. So social and political revolutions were also challenged. And so there was a lot going on at the time. The views about social stratification changed. And in addition to the revolutions that began to take place, the political map of the Americas changed dramatically as the colonizing territories fought for independence from their colonizers. So the Enlightenment, an outcome of the scientific revolution we have, it sought to apply the scientific method and rational inquiries to improve human life and society. And that was on a scientific level. Europe was the center of the Enlightenment, with France the epicenter of it all. So it was marked by a trend away from that church doctrine that we've been reading a lot about in the course. And so most philosophers, French that is, were deitists. So they believed in the existence of God, denied supernatural teachings of Christianity, and opposed the church for privileged positions of clergy and the accumulation of wealth. So people were beginning to take notice that the church had an abundance of wealth, and outside of that church was poverty. And French philosophers began to question that. Voltaire, a famous French philosopher from 1694 to 1778. We see his picture over to the right. He attacked the French monarchy and the Roman Catholic Church and called the religious toleration and freedom. So he felt that the masses of France should have freedom from some of the very tight constrictions that were placed on them by the church, and that some of the wealth needed to be shared. And the church and the monarchs were not seen as having the right to own most all of the wealth. Okay, so it held the church responsible for some of the human suffering that was going on at the time. So there was a rise of popular sovereignty, this supreme power. And so to the left, we see popular sovereignty, and to the right, divine right. John Locke, another philosopher, 1632 to 1704. We have the second treatise of civil government, 1690. And he argued that rulers derive power from consent of rule, meaning that the people should have some say-so over what the monarchs are doing at the time. Individuals retain personal rights and give political rights to rulers. So more of a democratic type of style of governing. Over to the right, divine right, ancient and medieval notions of kingship, mandate of heaven, divine rights of kings. And this is in reference to the kings that were ruling at the time, or any monarch at the time. So monarchs were given power and authority to govern from God and heaven. So this was like a divine right that was given to these people. And so those that they governed over were to see them as a segue, or someone who is a middleman between God and them, the commoner. And this job was that of the king. So freedom and political and legal equality. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712 to 1778, another French philosopher, argued for equality of all individuals, regardless of their class, before law. There was a class structure at the time, and you had your poor, you had your bourgeoisie, and then you had your monarchs. So in the social contract of 1762, he argued collectively society, the governed, that is, was the sovereign, meaning the supreme power, and they should be the ones that decide on what should be done or how they should be ruled. Not that power that is supreme power that's been given to the monarchs. So the Enlightenment ideals and women. So women often ran salons, but many male Enlightenment thinkers remained conservative regarding women's rights. And some of these salons were like places where you would go and see art and things like that. So Rousseau argued women should receive education to prepare for lives as wives and mothers, not politically active citizens. So women philosophies, Mary Astell out of England, 1666 to 1731, argued women essentially born into slavery because of the patriarchal society. So a sort of pseudo type of slavery where men are and placed on a higher level in society. Olympe de Gouges was French from 1748 to 1793. And she wrote the Declaration of Rights of Women and the Female Citizen, 1791. Mary Wollstonecraft out of England from 1759 to 1797 published the Vindication of Rights of Women. So a change in the Atlantic world. American Revolution, an American War for Independence takes place. The French Revolution takes place. And they actually took some of the tenets that were written during the American Revolution. They used that as a format for their revolution when they first got started. We have the Haitian Revolution that takes place, and also the Latin American independence movement. We know that a lot of the boundaries have changed and shifted, and the Americas look quite different. That Haitian Revolution, we know now the island known as Belize and Haiti. The Dominican Republic and Haiti. Dominican being Spanish and Haiti French. The Atlantic world in transition. So to the left we have the revolutions, and to the right the independence movements. So in the revolutions, the primary driver of the conflict was to alter the established form of government and change that whole status quo that's been the norm for so long. which is that the kings ran and ruled everything. They had supreme power. And it was rooted in the Enlightenment, where knowledge and power is shared. The independence movements, a primary driver of conflict was to achieve independence and overthrow either the colonization or colonizers or the mercantiles. And this was rooted in nationalism. So a little bit different. Okay, one is rooted based on your country and your loyalty to that. And the other, rooted in enlightenment, is the right to share some of the power and knowledge and success. So the American Revolution we'll start with. So there was little indication of this taking place in the mid-18th century. So colonists regarded themselves as British subjects prior to gaining their independence. Long cultural and personal connections with England, and they were mutually profitable military and economic relationship between the two. So during this time, the people in the Americas in the United States still identified with Great Britain and being a part of that in many cases. So you still had family there, in Britain. But the expensive French and Indian War took place in 1754 to 1763, and that overlapped the 7-Year War. So there was conflict in Europe and India, and British victory ensued, this global dominance, and North America's prosperity, but was created a very massive debt, which we know is not good. So tightened British control of the colonies and enforcing a mercantilism. So bills came due from the war. The French and the Indian War and the 7-Year War was very costly. So tax burdens increased in the British colonies in North America, meaning like the United States. There was the Sugar Act of 1764, the Stamp Act of 1765, the Quartering Act of 1765, housing of British troops being the Quartering Act, and of course the Tea Act of 1773. So that Sugar Act of 1764 was a tax passed down from Parliament, taxing molasses, of all things. The Stamp Act was a tax placed on newspapers and legal and commercial documents. The Quartering Act said that the people living in colonies had to provide housing for British soldiers. So it'd be like the United States sending over some army troops and saying, well, you gotta house these guys, right? And you have to open your door up to them, open your doors to them. The Tea Act was the British East Indian Company was given a monopoly over the tea sales and pretty much just raised the taxes to suit their desires financially. So we have the Americans boycotted these stages in protest. So we have the Boston Tea Party of 1773 protesting against, of course, that Tea Act. Tea was actually a very popular drink at the time. And it said no taxation without representation. I mean, you can't just tax us without us having a say-so, right? There's that supreme power thing going on again, where, Great Britain is dishing out these orders and the people have no say-so. So the Continental Congress was formed and ultimately issuing the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776, Declaration was adopted. And the influence of John Locke was the retention of individual rights and the sovereignty based on consent of the governed, which we saw previously, some of the same things that the French philosophers were arguing for. So building an independent nation state. So the British forces surrounded Yorktown, Virginia. And with the signing of that Treaty of Paris, British recognized the United States as independent. In 1787, the Constitution of the United States says political and legal equality for men and property, defining citizenship and voting rights left to the states. So each state, in essence, could and does even to this day have different voting rights. We all, as citizens of the United States, have the right to vote, but it can vary depending on the state that you're in. We know that there's been some new changes in some of the Republican states to this right now, currently, and a lot of controversy has come up over the new voting laws in Georgia. So the Bill of Rights of 1790 identifies rights retained by the people and by the states to limit central government. Central government being their federal government. So you have your federal that controls everything for citizens. However, that can still vary from state to state. So states still do have some say-so. Now we'll take a look at the French Revolution, which was from 1789 to 1799, which took place right after the United States Revolution. And so they were inspired by some of the things that the Americans had done to gain their independence, and even borrowed some of their tactics. The financial woes. There were serious physical problems in France and war debts, 1780s. 50% of the tax revenues went to pay off war debts. 25% of tax revenues went to the military. So the king needs approval for new taxes, calls on the Estates General. And the Estates General was founded in 1303 and had not met since 1614. So the three estates were, the first estate was 100,000 Roman Catholic clergy. The second estate was 400,000 nobles. And the third estate was everyone else. That was 24 million serfs, free peasants, and urban residents. So you can imagine that most of the power was consolidated in the first two states, just below the king, of course. That first estate and that second estate possessed most of the power and money. So in 1789, protests of nobility forced the King Louis to call Estates General for new taxes in 1789. So the demand from the third estate for greater social change And then in June, the secession of the third state from the Estates General renamed the National Assembly. So they separated themselves and renamed them. July, the mob attacked the Bastille, and there was a bloody battle, and it was won by the mob. And you may have heard of Bastille's Day. It is a very important holiday in France, and that's July 14th. So the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. In 1789, American influence, and there was equality of Frenchmen, women not included, unsuccessful attempt at the redress made by, of course, the Olympe Gouges, the Declaration of Rights of Women and the Female Citizen. So that's where that came from. And that supreme power resides in the people, and individual rights are protected. So these are some of the things that took place. Okay. And as you can see, there was that American influence on their fight for independence. The stated goals of the National Assembly, which was that third estate, which was everyone else, peasants and all. The old social order needs to be abolished and church land seized and clergy redefined as civilians. So no longer are they considered to be on a higher social level than that of the masses. So a new constitution retained the king, but subject to legislative authority. And the convention that took place, elected by the universal male suffrage, the levée en masse, conscription for war, and in 1793, King Louis and Queen Marie Antoinette were found guilty of treason and sent to the guillotines. The incorruptible-led Committee of Public Safety and leader of the Jacobin Party was Maximilien Robespierre. And this Jacobin Party was an anti-royalist party. So they were like very radical revolutionaries and revolutionariness. And they plotted the downfall of the king and passed reforms for equality for all. They dominated the convention in 1793 to 1794. Churches were closed, priests were forced to marry. They promoted cult of reason, a secular alternative to Christianity. The calendar was reorganized to 10-day weeks, a year, one proclaimed, and executed 40,000, imprisoned 300,000 during the Reign of Terror while this was going on. And during that Reign of Terror, there were, mass executions and a lot of deaths took place during that time as well. So, so much is going on in an attempt to change and fight for the rights of some of the more common people that were in France. The city changed considerably at that point. Art reflected a lot of the turmoil that was going on at the time and social change. The Directory from 1794 to 1799. Maximilian was arrested and sent to the guillotine. So that kind of put an end to that reign of terror. Men of property took power in the form of the Directory. So a more conservative approach to reshaping society took place. However, the 1795 Constitution did outlaw slavery in France. Yeah, but of course it was still going on in the Americas. Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769 to 1821, was an army officer under the king, and he was a general at the age of 24. That's quite impressive. He was a brilliant military strategist, and he overthrew the Directory in 1799. He established a new government, the Consulate, and he crowned himself emperor in 1802. So here we have a map of Napoleon's empire in 1812. It expanded to control most of the mainland of Europe, from the Iberian Peninsula to forced alliances with Austria and Prussia. And he also attempted to take Russia as well. So you can see that the outline in red is what you have. So you have the Kingdom of Spain, France, Austria, Italy, Prussia, and Denmark, the Kingdom of Denmark, and they stopped just short of Russia and the Ottoman Empire. So in Napoleon's empire, he was forced to abdicate in 1814 by the British, Austrian, Prussia, and Russian armies. He was exiled to an island of Elba and escaped to take power again for 100 days. And this time he was defeated by the British at Waterloo, and exiled to St. Helena. And he died in 1821. Now we have the Haitian Revolution. This was the only successful slave revolt and the most radical of the Atlantic revolutions. And they say that the country still suffers to this day because of that. It's one of the poorest Caribbean countries, which is, of course, part of that island next to the Dominican. Either they share an island. So this took place on the island of Hispaniola in the Spanish colony of Santo Domingo in the east, now the Dominican Republic, and the French colony of Santo Dominique in the west, now Haiti. So this was a rich Caribbean colony that had sugar and coffee and cotton plantations, and almost 1/3 of France's foreign trade profits came out of this small area. There were 40,000 French settlers here, so they dominated the social structure. There were 28,000 free people of color, or mixed race, or freed slaves, and they were holders of small plots. And there were 500,000 slaves. And there was a high mortality rate, and many fled to the mountains. So what happened during the revolt? It was inspired by the American and French Revolution. So 500 of these freed people of color were sent to fight the British in the American War of Independence. So in 1789, white settlers demanded self-rule, but with no equality for the freed people of color. So they wanted their independence from France, but that did not include the free people of color. So in 1791, Civil War broke out. The slaves revolted, and the French, British, and Spanish forces attempted to intervene and suppress this uprising. Of course, they were not successful. And upon assuming power, Napoleon tried to reassert French control and enslaved status for Haitians, which we know did not work. So to the left, we have Toussaint Louverture from 1744 to 1803. And he was the military leader of the Haitian Revolutionary Army that orchestrated the opposition to the French and the Spanish. He was born a slave and freed in 1776. And in 1801, he promulgated the Constitution of Equality. And in 1802, he was arrested by Napoleon's forces and died in jail. Liberté ou la mort is the Haitian flag from 1803 to 1804. Liberty or death. Give me liberty or give me death. The Haitian Revolution succeeds, and the French troops were driven out of the Haitian, driven out, and the Haitian independence was declared in 1804. The Haitian Constitution put an end to its slavery-based economic and social system and established in equality regardless of race and outlawed slavery. So many of the plantation owners and slave owners fled Haiti and actually fled to New Orleans and were held on ship right off of the coast, because the United States at this point said that no more slaves were allowed to be shipped in. And so these slave owners could not bring their slaves onto American soil, which they eventually got special approval and were allowed to do that. And that's when the Black population in New Orleans doubled, more than doubled at that time. That's why the city is predominantly Black to this day. Most of those were descendants of these slaves that were moved from Haiti to the United States with their slave owners. Continued change. So the Atlantic revolutions inspired a series of independent movements throughout Latin America and a transformation of government policies around the globe. And we can see a lot of that, the results of those, with France gaining a lot of social independence, and also social independence for some of the slaves, the peasants in France, and the slaves in Haiti, and of course the colonists in the United States. So there was a lot going on, and all of it was influenced by the American Revolution or United States Revolution. So that ends our lecture for today. And there's some wonderful art that's included in the readings out of the text. So take a look at some of those and enjoy.